The elevator doors closed with the kind of certainty that only polished brass and expert engineering can provide. The weight of expectation hung in the air, not just the weight of the machinery, not just the weight of the cables, but the weight of a name. Astor. A name that meant more than money. It meant legacy. It meant America itself, in all its gilded, towering ambition. The year was 1898, and New York City was reaching upward, clawing at the sky with steel and stone, trying to prove that wealth could defy gravity. The St. Regis Hotel was more than just a building. It was a promise. A promise that luxury had no ceiling, that elegance could be engineered, that the right amount of capital could transform raw earth into heaven on earth. But heaven, as it turns out, has a way of collapsing when the foundation is built on human hands. The air was crisp that autumn morning. The kind of cold that makes your breath visible, that makes you pull your collar tight, that makes the marble floors of a brand new hotel feel even colder under your feet. The St. Regis was still weeks away from its grand opening, but the construction was in its final, frantic phase. Workers moved through the halls like ants in a colony, each one carrying a piece of the dream. Painters touched up the crown molding. Electricians tested the newfangled lighting systems. And the elevator, the pride of the building, the mechanical marvel that would carry the wealthiest people in the world from the lobby to the penthouse without them ever having to lift a foot, was being tested again and again. The elevator was not just a machine. It was a statement. It said, "We have conquered inconvenience. We have conquered time. We have conquered the very limitations of the human body." But what it didn't say, what nobody wanted to admit, was this: every machine is only as safe as the person who built it. And every person who built it was exhausted, underpaid, and racing against a deadline that didn't care if they lived or died. Vincent Astor was 26 years old. He had inherited more money than most people could imagine in 100 lifetimes. His father, John Jacob Astor IV, was one of the wealthiest men in the world. Real estate. Shipping. Investments. The Astor fortune was so vast that it didn't need to be counted, it just existed, like gravity, like the ocean. Vincent had been raised in that world. Private tutors. European vacations. The kind of childhood where you never have to ask if something is possible, because everything is possible. But Vincent was not like his father. He was quieter. More thoughtful. He wanted to understand how things worked, not just enjoy the results. He was fascinated by engineering, by architecture, by the way a building could stand up against wind and time. And so, when the St. Regis Hotel was being built, when his father was pouring $5 million into the construction, a sum that would be worth over $160 million today, Vincent wanted to see it. He wanted to walk through the halls before the guests arrived. He wanted to watch the workers finish what his father's money had started. Nobody knows exactly why Vincent stepped into that elevator. Some say he was curious about the mechanics. Some say he was impatient and didn't want to take the stairs. Some say it was just bad luck, the kind of coincidence that makes you believe in fate. But what we do know is this: the elevator was not supposed to be in operation yet. It was still in the testing phase. The safety inspections had not been completed. The final adjustments had not been made. And yet, the doors opened. And Vincent stepped inside. The St. Regis Hotel was designed by the architectural firm Trowbridge and Livingston, a name that carried weight in the world of luxury construction. They had been tasked with creating something that would outshine every other hotel in Manhattan. The Waldorf Astoria was already famous. The Plaza was under construction. The competition for the wealthiest clientele was fierce, and the Astors were determined to win. The hotel would have 18 floors. 200 rooms. Marble imported from Italy. Chandeliers from France. Carpets woven by hand in Persia. Every detail was chosen to communicate one thing: this is where power sleeps. This is where wealth rests its head. And the elevator system, designed by the Otis Elevator Company, the same company that had revolutionized vertical transportation across America, was supposed to be the safest, smoothest, most reliable system ever installed in a private hotel. But safe is a relative term. Safe means that under normal circumstances, nothing will go wrong. But construction sites are not normal circumstances. Construction sites are chaos held together by schedules and sweat. The cable snapped. It wasn't a slow fray. It wasn't a gradual weakening. It was a sudden, catastrophic failure. One moment, the elevator was rising smoothly. The next, it was falling. And in that tiny, terrible window of time, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, Vincent Astor had just enough awareness to know what was happening. To feel the floor drop out from under him. To understand that his body was about to collide with the earth at a speed that no human frame was designed to survive. The sound, they say, was deafening. The crash echoed through the unfinished halls like thunder trapped indoors. Workers froze. Foremen shouted. Someone ran to pull the emergency brake, but it was too late. The elevator car had already hit the basement floor. The impact crumpled the metal like paper. If you're still listening to this, you're not here for entertainment. You're here because you understand that history isn't just dates and names. It's people. It's the moment when everything changes. And if that matters to you, if depth matters to you, then you're exactly the kind of person this work is made for. Vincent Astor did not die in that elevator. Let's be clear about that, because the story that follows is not about a young man's death, it's about something more complicated, something harder to name. Vincent survived the fall. But survival is not the same as being unharmed. His body was broken in ways that would take months to heal. Fractured ribs. A shattered pelvis. Internal injuries that the doctors of 1898 could barely diagnose, let alone treat. He was rushed to the family's private physician, carried out of the St. Regis on a stretcher while workers stood in silence, their caps in their hands, their faces pale. The newspapers would later call it a miraculous escape. But miracles, when you look closely, often come with a price. The Astor family moved quickly to control the narrative. This was not incompetence. This was not negligence. This was an unfortunate accident, a fluke, the kind of thing that happens when progress moves too fast. The family's lawyers spoke to the press. The Otis Elevator Company issued a statement assuring the public that their systems were safe, that this was an isolated incident, that adjustments had already been made. The St. Regis Hotel would still open on schedule. The show would go on. But inside the Astor mansion, behind closed doors, there was panic. Because Vincent was not just a son. He was the heir. The only male heir to the Astor fortune. And if something happened to him, if he didn't recover, if his injuries left him unable to manage the empire, then everything his father had built would be at risk. John Jacob Astor IV was a man who believed in control. He controlled his investments. He controlled his public image. He controlled the architecture of his buildings down to the smallest detail. But he could not control the elevator cable. He could not control the speed of the fall. And he could not control the fact that his son's body, no matter how much money was spent on doctors and rest and the finest care available, would never be the same. Vincent spent the winter of 1898 recovering. He was confined to bed. He could not walk. He could not sit up without pain. And while he lay there, staring at the ceiling of his family's mansion, the St. Regis Hotel opened its doors to the public. The grand ballroom was filled with the wealthiest families in America. Champagne flowed. Orchestras played. Everyone marveled at the elevators, which now worked perfectly, gliding up and down with mechanical grace. But Vincent was not there. And the absence of the heir was noted by everyone, even if no one said it out loud. The cost of the St. Regis Hotel was $5 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's more than $160 million in today's currency. The money came from the Astor real estate empire, which controlled vast swaths of Manhattan. The family owned entire blocks. They collected rent from thousands of tenants. They were, in the most literal sense, landlords of the city. But that kind of wealth is not passive. It requires management. It requires vision. It requires someone at the top who can make decisions quickly, who can see opportunities before anyone else, who can move capital like a chess player moves pieces. And for a few crucial months, while Vincent recovered, that person was missing. The workers who built the St. Regis were not wealthy. They were immigrants, most of them. Irish. Italian. Polish. They worked 12-hour days, sometimes more. They were paid by the week, and if they were injured, there was no insurance, no safety net, no guarantee that their families would be taken care of. When the elevator cable snapped, when Vincent Astor fell, the workers were blamed. Not publicly. Not officially. But in the quiet conversations between foremen and contractors, in the meetings where adjustments were discussed, the message was clear: someone had not done their job. Someone had cut a corner. Someone had failed to inspect the cable properly. And that someone would never be identified by name, because the truth is, on a construction site that size, with that many moving parts, it's almost impossible to pin responsibility on a single person. The blame dissolves into the machinery. It becomes part of the building itself. Before we go further, ask yourself this: when something goes wrong, who pays the price? Is it the person at the top, or the person at the bottom? If you've ever wondered about that, you're asking the same question historians ask. And if you want more stories that dig into that question, that don't look away, then this is the place for it. Vincent Astor eventually recovered. Physically, at least. He learned to walk again. He learned to manage the pain. But something had changed. Those who knew him said he was different after the accident. Quieter. More withdrawn. Less interested in the social games that his father played so well. He had always been thoughtful, but now he was cautious. He had felt the floor drop out from under him. He had learned that no amount of money, no amount of engineering, no amount of planning could guarantee safety. And that knowledge, that deep, bone-level understanding, never left him. He would go on to manage the Astor fortune. He would serve in World War I. He would marry, divorce, and remarry. He would live a long life by the standards of his time. But he would never forget the sound of the cable snapping. The feeling of the fall. The moment when control was taken from him completely. The St. Regis Hotel became one of the most famous hotels in the world. It hosted presidents. It hosted royalty. It became synonymous with elegance and prestige. And the elevators, those beautiful, terrifying machines, worked perfectly for decades. The accident was never mentioned in the hotel's promotional materials. It was not part of the story the Astor family wanted to tell. But it was part of the story nonetheless. Because every building has a ghost. Every fortune has a crack. And sometimes, the crack is not visible until you look closely at the people who were there when it happened. The workers who built the St. Regis did not have their names carved into the marble. They did not have plaques commemorating their labor. They were invisible, the way most labor is invisible when the final product is beautiful. But they were there. Every brick. Every pane of glass. Every foot of elevator cable. It was their hands that made it real. And when the cable snapped, it was their fault, according to the official record. But the official record doesn't ask the right questions. It doesn't ask, how many hours had they been working? How much sleep had they lost? How much pressure had they been under to finish on time? Because when you build heaven on earth, someone has to pay for it. And it's never the people who get to live there. Let's talk about the money. $5 million in 1898. That's not just a number. That's a statement of intent. That's a declaration that says, we are willing to spend whatever it takes to be the best. The Astor family had the liquidity to fund the entire project without borrowing a single dollar. They didn't need investors. They didn't need loans. They had the capital on hand, sitting in accounts, generating interest, waiting to be deployed. And when Jacob Astor IV decided to build the St. Regis, he deployed it all at once. This was not a speculative venture. This was not a gamble. This was a move to cement the Astor name in the physical landscape of New York City. Because real estate, unlike stocks, unlike shipping, unlike any other form of wealth, is permanent. You can see it. You can touch it. You can walk past it every day and know that it belongs to you. And that permanence is worth more than any amount of liquid capital. But permanence is an illusion. Buildings crumble. Empires collapse. And the Astor fortune, as vast as it was, would not last forever. The next generation would see it divided. The generation after that would see it diluted. Inheritance taxes, introduced in the early 20th century, would chip away at the wealth that had seemed untouchable. The operating costs of maintaining properties like the St. Regis would rise. The market would shift. And slowly, over decades, the Astor empire would shrink. Not because of incompetence. Not because of scandal. But because wealth, no matter how large, is subject to the same forces as everything else: time, change, entropy, Vincent Astor's life after the accident was defined by that knowledge. He saw his father's world, the world of absolute confidence, of unshakable belief in progress, begin to crack. He lived through World War I, which shattered the illusion that civilization was moving in a straight line toward something better. He lived through the Great Depression, which destroyed fortunes that had seemed as solid as the St. Regis itself. And through it all, he carried the memory of the fall. The sound of the cable snapping. The moment when the floor disappeared. If this made you pause, that pause matters. These stories take time to research, to write, to tell in a way that doesn't look away from the hard parts. And support, whether it's a comment, a share, or just staying until the end, keeps them possible. The legal aftermath of the accident was quiet. Too quiet. There was no public lawsuit. There was no trial. The Astor family did not sue the Otis Elevator Company. The Otis Elevator Company did not admit fault. The workers who installed the elevator were not named in any official report. It was as if the accident had never happened. Except, of course, it had. Vincent's injuries were real. The months of recovery were real. The fear that he might never walk again was real. But none of that made it into the public record. Because when you have enough money, you can buy silence. You can settle things privately. You can make sure that the narrative stays clean, that the brand remains untarnished, that the machine of progress keeps moving without interruption. This is how wealth protects itself. Not with walls, not with guards, but with paperwork. With quiet conversations in private offices. With agreements signed behind closed doors. The workers who built the St. Regis had no such protection. If they were injured, they had no legal recourse. If they died, their families had no compensation. The concept of workers' compensation did not exist in any meaningful way in 1898. You worked at your own risk. And if something went wrong, you bore the cost. Not the company. Not the contractor. You. There's a philosophical question buried in this. If a system is designed to protect the people at the top and leave the people at the bottom exposed, is that system just? And if it's not just, why does it persist? The answer, of course, is power. The people at the top have the power to design the system. And they design it to serve their interests. Not out of cruelty, necessarily. Not even out of malice. But out of a belief that their interests are the most important. That their vision is the one that matters. That their safety, their comfort, their success is worth more than the safety, comfort, and success of the people who make it possible. Vincent Astor, to his credit, seemed to understand this. Later in his life, he became known for his philanthropy. He donated millions to hospitals, to schools, to social programs. He funded research into public health. He supported housing projects for the poor. Some historians see this as genuine compassion. Others see it as guilt. But maybe it's both. Maybe surviving the fall taught him something that his father's generation never learned, that the floor can drop out from under anyone. That no amount of money makes you immune to disaster. That the only thing that separates the heir from the worker is luck. And luck, as we all know, can change in an instant. The St. Regis Hotel is still standing. It's a landmark now. A piece of history. If you walk past it today, you can admire the architecture. You can imagine what it must have been like in 1898, when it first opened, when the elevators were the talk of the city. But if you know the story, if you know about the cable, the fall, the months of recovery, you see it differently. You see the cracks in the marble. You see the shadows in the corners. You see the ghosts of the workers who built it, who bled for it, who were never thanked for it. And you see Vincent Astor, standing in that elevator, feeling the floor disappear, learning the hardest lesson of all, that wealth can buy almost anything, but it cannot buy control. It cannot buy certainty. It cannot buy the one thing that everyone, rich or poor, wants most, the guarantee that tomorrow will be safe. The financial mechanics of the St. Regis project are worth examining in detail, because they reveal how wealth operates at that scale. The $5 million was not spent all at once. It was allocated over the course of the construction, which took nearly 3 years. Labor costs accounted for roughly 30% of the budget. Materials, marble, steel, glass, wood, accounted for another 40%. The remaining 30% went to design fees, permits, legal costs, and the inevitable overruns that come with any large project. The Astor family financed the construction through their real estate holdings. They owned so much property in Manhattan that they could use the rental income from existing buildings to fund new ones. This is how generational wealth works. It compounds. It builds on itself. One investment generates income, which funds the next investment, which generates more income, and so on. The St. Regis was not a risk. It was a certainty. Because even if the hotel itself lost money, which it didn't, the Astor family had enough other income streams to absorb the loss. But here's the thing about that kind of wealth: it makes you invisible to risk in a way that distorts your understanding of the world. If you can afford to lose $5 million and still be wealthy, then $5 million doesn't feel real to you. It's just a number. It's just capital to be allocated. And when you stop feeling the weight of money, you stop understanding the weight of decisions. You stop thinking about the workers who are tired, who are cutting corners because they have to, who are one mistake away from disaster. Because disaster, for you, is always theoretical. It's always something that happens to other people. Until it doesn't. The elevator cable that snapped was made of steel. It was tested at the factory. It was inspected when it arrived at the site. It was installed by trained professionals. And yet, it failed. Investigations after the accident suggested that the cable had been weakened during installation. A small fray. A tiny imperfection. Something that wouldn't have been visible to the naked eye. Something that, under normal circumstances, the elevator's safety mechanisms should have caught. But the safety mechanisms were still being calibrated. The elevator was in testing mode. It was not supposed to be carrying passengers. And yet, the doors opened. And Vincent stepped inside. Some say the doors were left unlocked by accident. Some say a worker, eager to show off the new system, activated it early. Some say Vincent himself, curious and impatient, overrode the safety protocols. We'll never know for sure. But what we do know is this: the accident was preventable. It was the result of a chain of small failures, each one insignificant on its own, but catastrophic when combined. This is how most disasters happen. Not because of one big mistake, but because of a dozen small ones. A worker who skips a step because he's tired. A manager who doesn't double-check because he's behind schedule. An engineer who assumes the system is safe because it's supposed to be. And then, all at once, the chain breaks. The cable snaps. And someone falls. If you're still here, you're here for more than spectacle. You're here because you know that understanding how things fall apart is just as important as understanding how they're built. And if that resonates with you, then you're exactly the kind of person this work is for. Jacob Astor IV did not live to see the full impact of the accident.